if there's one good thing about the corona crisis, that's because we can meet freely now. We have learned to interconnect live and direct virtually. Okay, so I guess what I'm going to talk today about, and I'm not sure how how well this can be received if I look at sort of the name of your unit, crop production ecology, but I guess trees are also a crop. And this is definitely about also production or the loss of production, and it's about ecology also, so I guess that's fine. Seen here is a picture that I've taken last year, or no, 2 years actually, already in 2019, when I did my firewood in Germany, close to where I live. And what you can see nicely on this picture is that the forest doesn't look too well. There will be other pictures of forest not looking too well, but the interesting part of this is that it's sort of like this diffuse mortality that is spreading throughout the forest, which is hard to predict. And I think what we need to do is to include more physiology into the predictions, and I hope I can make this point during the presentation. So I guess I would like you to take 3 messages back home. So first of all, that tree mortality in response to climate change is a global phenomenon. I don't know, in the few minutes before starting that meeting, we were sort of chatting a bit whether the forest looks similar to what I have here in the background. This is a picture from also taken here in Jena. Apparently in Sweden, that's not the case, but I warn you, 4 years ago, nobody would have thought that the forest in Germany would look like this here in the background. So it is a global phenomenon, and you better be prepared for what's coming. Predicting tree mortality is difficult, and Holger is going to continue with this, and I guess he has a few words to say to that also. And then carbon storage is a critical process of tree resilience, and which I do think is one of the weak spots in the models that allow us to predict forest dynamics into the future. So these are other images. This is the region where I grew up. When I was a child, I was playing in these forests. They looked probably a bit like what you would expect, or what I would expect from the Swedish forest. So these were dense spruce forests. When you walked in there, it was really dark and you couldn't see the sky anymore. And this is how these landscapes look like at the moment. So there's something really strong and devastating has happened after the 2018-2019 droughts here in Central Europe. However, as I mentioned before, this is something that actually could have been expected. And I think in Germany, we weren't prepared for this because we thought we had once a Waldsterben, so this forest mortality in the 80s, and sort of we got away with it by, you know, reducing emissions of pollutants into the atmosphere, and we were sort of shielded from further changes in the forest and forest mortality or tree mortality. However, if you look at this, and this was already taken an assessment in 2009, Craig Allen, you can see that there were already observations accumulating basically across the globe in all forested biomes, showing that climate change events like drought, and so extreme events like drought and heat spells, would cause tree mortality. We have accumulated this database. It will actually be published very soon on our International Tree Mortality webpage. Bill Hammond has done a very nice analysis, which will be published very soon in Nature Communications, where he can show that there is a unique climate fingerprint that causes these events. So there is a common sort of signal across all these different events and across all these biomes, a deviation from normal conditions that trigger tree mortality across the globe. So as you see here, looking at these color codes here, there's more and more of these mortality events that are accumulating. And well, actually, there looks like there's a bit going on in Sweden also, but probably there will be more in the near future. I'm sorry to tell you that. So looking at these maps, one also wonders how the future is going to look like. Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball and we cannot just spell into the future and see what's going on, but we do have models that allow us to get at least an idea of how likely changes in forest covers or forest dynamics will be. This here is from the Sitchin paper from 2008, so it's not very recent. However, it has these really nice figures to document what I want to show you here. So these are predictions of the forest cover change by 2099, given the current emission scenarios that we're still on. So we keep on going emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. With this, we have an increase in the annual temperatures and also more frequent extreme events. The blue colors actually mean that there is an increase in forest cover, and the warmer colors a decrease. So looking at one model, you see that, well, you know, in the Amazon, there's going to be some declines at 50%. That's already a lot. But then if you go through the different model protections, LPJ3 here, oh, well, you know, the European forests seem to be disappearing. Actually, this is what we're experiencing now. Whereas there is definitely a greening of the northern latitudes. Then here, well, there isn't much change compared to here. The European forests are not really affected, but then again, we see the strong greening. The Amazon is still affected, but still, and here now, you know, basically the Amazon is sort of wiped out, and we have this greening in the northern latitudes also. So there is some sort of an overlap here and there, but, you know, going through all these different, going through all these different model predictions, you can see that it's not sort of like a common clear pattern that would emerge from the different predictions. So modeling is definitely something that is, or predicting tree dynamics, tree mortality is something that is not trivial. Well, you could say, well, that was in 2008, that's 12 years ago, and, you know, 13 years ago, actually, and we live in a fast era, so basically, probably this has evolved. Well, if you look at very recent paper, this is from Tom Pugh, and you look again, this is carbon turnover time. So it's a little different, but carbon turnover is sort of like the input of carbon. So what goes into the ecosystems via photosynthesis over what's leaving the ecosystem in terms of mortality. And I can tell you, and I'm going to show this in the next slide, that the input models are really good at predicting this or modeling this. However, what you can see here, all these differences in the model predictions of the carbon turnover rate is basically due to the fact that the models do not very well at predicting mortality, and they all do different. So the crystal ball that we have at our hand is not very reliable, so we don't really know what's going on. In a very recent work that I just authored, and it's going to be published in the annual reviews in plant biology, we actually take a few of these events where we know that mortality occurred, strong mortality, as you see here in the background. And then we compare this with model prediction here, one of the state-of-the-art models, LPJ-GESS. And we also look at, so we have the model predictions in terms of mortality. Red part here is drought-related mortality. The gray parts here is mortality that is related to, you know, disturbances others than what could be caused by drought. And then we have the what color is that? Sort of bluish line here, which is the carbon input. And then we also have the EVI, so the Enhanced Vegetation Index. This is taken from the satellite and gives an indication of the vitality of these forests seen from above. These lines here are the mortality events that actually occurred. So I only show you 2 examples in the paper. We actually present 8. This is from New Mexico. It's well documented. You've probably seen the presentations from Craig Allen or Nate McDowell or Dave Brashears. So basically here we have the strong mortality event that killed more than 50% of the forest. And if you look at sort of the input from the model, well, you see that there is a decline. So the input is well modeled. This is also reflected in the EVI, and you see that there is a decent correlation between these 2 lines. So the models are good at predicting or forecasting, or in that case, it's actually hindcasting, the carbon input. And here actually at this mortality event, well, it's actually showing that there is a peak in mortality, but at the same time, there's other years for the same site where there was no mortality, and the model is doing it as well. So it's sort of like a spurious event that occurs here that hasn't occurred out in the field. For the second example I'm showing you here, you see that mortality event in 2015, and the model basically doesn't show any mortality at all. So there is definitely the bottom line is that the predictions may work sometimes, but often they do not, and we don't really know why this is the case. So there is leeway of improving models. Already in 2008, Stitch said that improving the ability of the models is basically what we need. We need better prediction in the plant responses to drought and heat stress. And even newer publications also underline that there is definitely the US in that particular instance. They talk about the biotic disturbances, and for example, you're all aware of the damages that have been done by the bark beetle here in Central Europe and maybe also in Scandinavia. This is too far from this presentation, but I'm going to focus here on the plant responses to drought and heat and how this may be improved. I'm invoking here the concept of resilience, and I'm talking to ecologists here. So there's different ways of looking at resilience, and I'm actually not taking up the strict definition of ecological resilience where you have maybe different states, but rather the sort of organismic definition that relates to the stress response in terms of recovery. So in that case here, resilience, what I'm talking about is, so there is a stress event, you have a plant process, whether it's photosynthesis or it is water transport or whatever it is, and you see that stress causes a decline, and the resilience is basically the time and the degree of recovery of the organism that makes then up whether this organism will survive or in that case would take another state with its death, and it wouldn't survive. So for plants, a very central concept how resilience is promoted is basically via their currency. So you have, and you all know this, I'm preaching to the converted here, obviously photosynthesis is producing sugars. So you have this pool of non-structural carbohydrates, and these are used to run metabolism. They can be transported into different parts of the plant. They are used for osmoregulation, really important during drought, but they also can be exported, let's say, to some symbiotic interactions. Obviously, then you have different other processes and functions like the secondary metabolism that allows to either communicate or, for example, to defend against herbivores or something. However, a central concept that is really related to this resilience is storage. So if you have photosynthesis, you produce this, and some of it is being put here, but some of that can be actually put aside a bit, like when you put money into a savings account, because you never know whether your car breaks down next year and you can just afford buying another car out of your current expenses, and then you put something aside, and when you need it and there's a need for to mobilize this, you can actually then replace what has been damaged or has been lost, in that case for a plant. So models often look at this reserve pool, although it has this very central mechanism in plants, is sort of like an annual overflow pool. So you have CO2 that comes via photosynthesis as non-structural carbohydrates or the sugars, and then these are used to grow biomass. You need to respire in order to produce the energy that you need to grow, to build up that biomass. But basically, only once this is all satiated or satisfied, then whatever is left over is going to put into this reserve pool. So it's sort of like what some people call a passive storage function, although which I do think also is not a very accurate term, because nothing in plants actually occurs passively. It is still being put aside on an active way. However, it's only sort of like the priority of that reserve pool is very low. Yet when you use that, and I did this in a paper that we published in 2018 in Environmental and Experimental Botany, where we actually reduced the size of that pool by 50%, and then we allowed annual defoliation. So in the mid growing season, we assumed that we just take 50% off here of that foliage. No, we took the foliage away. So then these reserves pool would have been used to rebuild the foliage. And this would then mean that the plant, in that case, couldn't rebuild the reserve pool that is required the next year to build up foliage again, so in springtime. So what you can see that if you do this with the model, these plants die pretty soon following these series of defoliation. And as you will see in a few minutes, this is not entirely realistic. So the question then is, are sea reserves an annual reserve pool actually, or an annual pool, and cannot be carried over besides the little bit of carbon that is being carried over to produce leaves in the next spring? So can plants actually use old carbon? And when I talk about plants, obviously here I talk about trees because they have secondary growth and they have a huge woody body in which you find lots of living cells. So even within the stem, although the xylem is made up of lots of dead cells, you see the parenchyma cells that are spread out through the xylem. And in these cells are a lot of carbohydrates that are stored. And given the temporal depth of this tissue, so you get not only carbon reserves from the current year, but you find also carbon that is actually from previous growing seasons, and some of them actually could be very old. So the idea that the models are not reproducing the structure of these trees really reliably is obviously very close. What we did to test whether trees are actually using older carbon is that system. As Holger mentioned, I stayed in Canada for a while in the region where maple syrup is being produced. And if you're not familiar with this, although I think in Sweden you do this with birches also, basically maple syrup is produced from the sugar sap that occurs in the very springtime before the leaves are before the buds are bursting, so before the leaves are occurring. So basically, this sugar sap is mobilized reserve pools in the stem. And using a global atmospheric isotopic labeling, and I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this, but due to the nuclear bomb testing in the 1960s, we got an increase in the radiocarbon content of the atmosphere. And then once these tests were banned, and due to the dilution from fossil fuel emissions, but also the uptake by the vegetation and also by the oceans, you get this nice exponential decline in the radiocarbon content of the atmosphere. And this you can use to estimate the carbon age, or the time since carbon had been assimilated in a particular plant tissue. So imagine here, this is in 2000, let's say 5 or 8, whatever. You take a sample, a branch of a tree, and you look at the radiocarbon signature, so the radiocarbon content, and what you definitely will find that this is higher than the atmospheric signal. And this then allows you to make inferences on the time that has elapsed since this carbon had been taken up, because this value is higher. You go back onto that declining curve, and you see that the carbon that you've sampled in 2008, whatever, actually was assimilated in 1980. So it gives you an indication of how old that carbon is. And we applied this to that maple sap on 2 different sites in Canada, as I don't have to give you really the details here. And this is throughout the sugar season. So we took several samples throughout the season. And basically what we find here is that the sugars that are mobilized in the springtime to rebuild the foliage has been produced or assimilated 3 to 5 years prior to that particular springtime. In turn, what this means that you have a buffer of at least 3 to 5 years without assimilation that this tree can survive. And this makes a lot of sense in that region where I worked, and I have to sort of walk you through that series here. So basically, this is an index that shows where the defoliation by a tent forest caterpillar caused a really strong decline in the growth rates of the sugar maples that were defoliated several years in a row. So this picture here actually shows you a summertime image of a sugar maple stand. And using dendrochronology approach, we could see that every about 9 years, you get a defoliation that lasts about 3 to 5 years. So there is a very nice system that has established the sugar maples that have a buffer of 3 to 5 years that they can last without leaves, and then ecological interactions with the forest tent caterpillar that actually causes this. So it's a perfect match in how these different organisms have evolved. Then we have done also a girdling approach. So basically, and we've done this in Canada, but also in Finland. In Finland, it was white birch. In Canada, it was sugar maple. So basically, we girdled these trees and we put stem chamber on the lower section of these stems, and we collected CO2. Basically, we measured the CO2 exchanges in that in these chambers, which allowed us first to give an indication of the fluxes, but also then sampling the CO2 also of the age of the sugars that had been used to produce via respiration this CO2. And what we can see here for sugar maple, here's the girdling event. So this goes over 2 seasons. We have measured this. We see that in the beginning, there's no differences between the control in red and the girdling here in blue. What you can see that very shortly after the girdling, there is a strong decline in the fluxes. So the trees reduce metabolism because there is no carbon input going down the stem from the canopy into that section that has now been separated via the girdling. And this is even stronger than in the second growing season. And here for white birch, basically it's the same, although the data is a little more sparse, but you can see the same pattern. But then also what we see is that the carbon age goes up. So the tree has less carbon available in that stem section. It reduces metabolism, but at the same time, it digs deeper and deeper into that storage pool in the inside of the tree stems. As you can see that the carbon age after the girdling event is definitely much higher in the girdle trees here shown in red than in the control trees here shown in black. So they use old reserves to survive these harsh periods of the decrease in carbon supply, which is against basically what models would predict. Jan Moore, a colleague of mine who's now in Göttingen, but he was at our institute, he has done similar experiments even in the tropics. And he basically found the same thing. In that case, they also did a girdling on one species here. And basically, he could find that the age of the carbon that is being emitted from these stem sections can go up to 17 years. So there is carbon that has been assimilated 17 years that is used to survive these harsh periods. Then the second question, if we say, okay, it's not only an annual carbon pool that should be sort of implemented in the model, but rather in temporal depth of the model, is this actually an overflow pool? So are only other sort of functions served with carbon from photosynthesis first, and only what's left over goes into that reserve pool? In order to test this, we've done a CO2 manipulation experiment. So the idea with this here, so we use spruce trees, you can really see them here because of the reflections of the sun. However, I wanted to show here how complicated this setup was. So basically we put small trees in these chambers, and then we either gave them 400 ppm CO2, similar to what they would experience outside, or we progressively reduce the CO2 concentration to a point where they would reach the carbon compensation point. So obviously we measured the CO2 concentration that goes in, but also the CO2 concentration that goes out. And if this equals 0, you're at the carbon compensation point. So you get as much input as you lose via respiration. But then we also had a treatment where we put these trees into even a worse situation. So we actually put them into a carbon starvation treatment. And here, this is sort of based on the logic that, let's say, you would have very little income left at the end of the month, and whatever you would spend this for, and if you can spend something for, this would be sort of a priority. And at the same time, would you keep up still putting money into your account even if you have less money available? So basically, you get less input, less money. Would you consistently put something into storage, which would mean, in our case, obviously the bank account for these trees, would they maintain the carbohydrate levels, because maybe next year is even worse. So in terms of carbon allocation priority. So what we've seen when we look at the sugar levels, so which is sort of the bank account for these trees here. So basically what we see that they decline for all treatments. So positive here, the 400s, these are the 120, and these are the 50 ppm, so the carbon starvation treatment. This is because these trees go into a chamber, light levels are lower and whatsoever. However, what we can see is, despite the fact that they decrease for all treatments, once they're in these chambers, they establish some sort of like an equilibrium. So even if they stay for longer, in that case, we're showing here 8 weeks, from 4 to 8 weeks, the carbohydrate levels remain the same. So the trees lower their metabolic activity, but then they try to establish on a very functional and stable level. But what we also wanted to look at is not whether, obviously, if you get less carbon in, you can put less into your bank account or you can put less into storage. But we also wanted to see whether there is sort of like a genetic hardwiring for activity to put, despite the fact that you have little, still something into carbon storage. So if you have someone who has less income, still would put money into the bank account, maybe wouldn't succeed in putting much because there isn't much income, but still would trying. So sort of like the intention. And to do this, we looked at the transcriptome of these different treatments here, showing for the carbon compensation point, so the changes compared to the control level. And let me tell you, I'm not a molecular biologist, and the molecular biologist working with us taught me that it's not really that straightforward to interpret the transcriptome data. But what we can see from these changes in the expression level, so if it goes to the red, it's an increase in the expression levels. If it goes into the blue colors, it's a decrease. And it's hard to say, okay, an increase in the expression level is always an increase in sort of the process or the function. But what we can see here is that if you put these trees close to the carbon compensation point, so reduce the income, so then they have to really manage their carbon metabolism, and you see this activity in all different functional processes. So whether it's related to photosynthesis, to respiration, so what you lose, but also storage and growth, and also storage utilization. So these trees become sort of nervous and try to get along with that situation. More interesting, although, is that when they are under carbon starvation, and we observed that they actually were giving up biomass, though they experienced a partial die-off. So what they do actually, and this is shown here in this glyoxylate cycle and these strong increases, that they're actually trying to digest themselves. So the fatty acid metabolism is increased here. And as we've shown before, apparently to also maintain some of the storage functions. So as I mentioned, these are very basically complicated interpretations that we had to also rely on the expertise of our molecular biologists. But what it shows that these trees are actually very hardwired into putting something into reserves. And from an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense, because trees have to survive not only a whole season or not only 2 years, but they have to survive decades and sometimes centuries in order to increase fitness, and you never know what the next year is going to look like. So basically, I think the improvements that can be made in models to make them more realistic and to have a component that improves resilience of these trees is to have not only different storage components. So we showed that basically wood reserves are really important. It's the stem, but you find this also at the level of the leaf level. You have different temporal buffers, and also obviously in the root system. And then also you would need this temporal depth, that you do not only have an annual reserve pool, but that you actually get very old reserves as you find them in the trees, because they can be fed into metabolism when they need it. And that the buildup of reserves is not only sort of like this overflow, but it definitely is something that has a high allocation priority, because trees have to survive many years to get offspring and to optimize their fitness. So the summary very quickly again: reserves are priority, allocation sink in trees. These old pools can be mobilized, and this is really important to avoid starvation. And we really do need more complex and more realistic implementation of this storage dynamics in trees in order to make them more realistic and being able to predict what we see out in nature. Thank you very much.